should be congratulated for taking a stand.
If you switch on the TV news in Mexico, you'll have to sit through plenty of government ads starring President Enrique Pena Nieto waxing political.
Desde luego tenemos que atender lo que no está bien y seguir siendo críticos. Es parte de nuestra democracia. De la crítica se aprende y se corrige.
An elected leader apparently welcoming criticism, or that's what it sounds like. Good news for Mexican journalists, were it not for the fact that the news organizations they work for depend on the revenue from these kinds of political ads to stay in business.
Pero cuenta mucho.
Es una paradoja más o menos simple.
It's a fairly straightforward paradox. If your main client is the government, you cannot criticize the government, because if the government pulls the plug, your business cannot survive.
No tiene posibilidades de vivir.
The amount of money handled is dangerous, but the way it is distributed is even more so, because there are no controls to determine which media outlets are receiving it and how much is being allocated to disseminate certain messages.
Juntos hemos generado 3 millones de nuevos empleos formales en un solo sexenio.
La publicidad oficial en sí misma no.
State advertising isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. What is bad is when it becomes an exchange currency, which can be used to either punish or reward, and which can be used to control media content.
In the past few years, Peña Nieto's government has fallen short on promises to boost spending on education, health, social services, but it still found $2 billion worth of public funds to spend on government ads. That's 70% more than stipulated by law. Broadcasting giants Televisa and Azteca both get around 10% of their ad revenue from the federal government. The country's newspapers of record, like Milenio, El Universal, Excelsior, rely on the government for millions of dollars to keep them going. In 2014, journalist Carmen Aristegui broke a story on her radio show, Aristegui Noticias, revealing how the president's wife, Angélica Rivera, had bought a luxury home from a company that had been awarded millions in government contracts. A firestorm ensued, and the MVS radio network, Aristegui's employers, fired her and her team of reporters, citing internal issues unrelated to the report. No one bought that story.
Previously, the owner of the radio network said that report, which directly affected President Enrique Pena Nieto, would put them in a complicated situation, that it would be difficult for them to defend themselves because a communication company as big as that depends largely on being on good terms with the government. It became obvious that they preferred to stand by the interests of the government instead of defending the journalists who worked there.
What this often leads to is journalists actually opting out of doing an investigation because they know it's just not going to get published. Newspapers would rather bury these stories because they know it could be costly for them not to. So there is clearly a correlation between how critical you are. The more serious journalism you do, the fewer the state resources you will be able to access. This is the government's approach. You either take the carrot or you get the stick.
It's almost seen as the norm that at some point you'll be required to cut down your article, tweak the headline, make it more low-key. All journalists will experience this practice at some point. And then there's the problem of self-censorship, which is hard to pinpoint. We can only see its shadows. It's hard to say what the real magnitude of the problem really is.
The symbiotic relationship between the Mexican state and the press goes way back. In the 1970s, President López Portillo said of the media, "I don't pay for them to beat me," and withdrew government advertising in Proceso, the only major independent weekly. López Portillo was the leader of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, who ruled uninterrupted for 70 years, during which they were rarely held to account. When they were voted out in 2000, successive governments promised a freer press, but the complicity between the media and the state persisted. When Peña Nieto and the PRI were voted back into power in 2012, he pledged to bring ad spending down. Instead, he spent more than any other Mexican leader in Mexican history. Media watchdogs have taken the government to court on this matter, and last year the Supreme Court sided with them, demanding laws to curb ad spending and for it to be distributed in an unbiased way. But those pushing for change say the laws drafted are toothless.
We got a big surprise last year when the Supreme Court recognized that the opacity and the lack of regulation in the governmental advertising has a direct impact on the freedom of speech in Mexico. Unfortunately, what we saw is that the lawmakers pretended to meet the requirement. They passed a law, but they didn't take this historic opportunity to change this perverse relationship and to create a free media in the country.
In Mexico, the media industry as a whole was really born out of the system of clientelism, in which bartering is predominant among the media and politicians.
Quiero saludar a don Emilio Azcárraga, presidente de Televisa. Quiere expresar que para los mexicanos es motivo de orgullo tener una empresa mexicana, productora del mayor número de contenidos de habla hispana.
This inertia is something that's been at work for decades. The incentives for the media to carry on with this mode of self-preservation are just too strong, too powerful. That's why it's so difficult to put a stop to it.
These are tough times for the Mexican media. Declining circulation, budget cuts, staff layoffs. For all the criticism, government ads do give media outlets a lifeline, but it's also a system that lends itself to corruption. Some outlets are taking advantage, pocketing government money without generating any real news content.
It creates a strange sort of market. Mexico is a country where there are a lot of newspapers and they just keep producing more. Given that this is not a country where people read a lot, and we also know that there's this crisis in the written press, this practice just allows for a false market.
Muchos más medios de los que se necesitan.
There are far more media outlets in Mexico than is actually necessary, and that's thanks to state advertising. Publications that sell 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 copies in a city of 20 million inhabitants. We have all these media outlets that don't need to have a readership, because what they are after is advertising revenue.
Es por buscar publicidad oficial.
One outlet that says it remains untouched by that source of revenue is Moreno's own, Animal Político. Last year, it put the government on the spot when it revealed that the Department of Education had spent more of its national budget on public relations than on the training of teachers. Animal Político and other alternative sites like Aristegui Noticias and Reforma are feeding the public's hunger for muckraking journalism as a presidential election approaches. If the polls are to be believed, disenchanted Mexicans will be voting the ruling party out of office. But whether the next president changes a habit of a lifetime and cures media outlets of their addiction to government advertising remains, as they say in the news business, to be seen.